Kia ora koutou. We're now at the next keynote session for today, and I am beyond happy to introduce the next two speakers. They're actually two of a handful of very lucky people who have spent time with my possum. Now, that's not a euphemism. Although I could talk to them later about that if they want to make that a euphemism. That's a fact. And we live on a property that has a resident brush-tailed possum. She's also, of course, a persecuted victim of European colonisation here, as much as everybody else, including our native species, I think. Nik and Heather were very lucky, and they were very honoured to meet our resident possum. I'm not sure what she thought of them though, or whether she really wanted to meet them. But I'm honoured to be introducing Nik and Heather today. They're two of my heroes of critical animal studies, and the reason for this is because they're dedicated to analysing in-depth issues about class, socio-economic status and privilege. And these are issues that are not often included in critical animal studies analysis or other forms even of feminist analysis, including in the area of animal studies. So they offer something that's unique and I think very, very important. They asked me not to give a very formal introduction, which is part of how awesome they are, because as you know, if you've met Heather and Nik, they're very down-to-earth people, no airs and graces, they're just who they are, and they welcome you to come and talk to them, of course, about anything in relation to what they're talking about. So, you know, these are just, I think, people who are the heart and soul of critical animal studies, intersectional analysis at its best. So Heather Fraser is an Associate Professor in Social Science in the School of Public Health and Social Work at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane. She's a critical social work and vegan feminist who's been teaching social work students for over 25 years. Her research interests, while varied, all centre on questions of privilege and oppression. And in the last 7 years, she's been working on projects that are relating to human-animal interactions and relationships with these kinds of questions in mind. Heather's written 4 books, including Neoliberalisation, Universities and the Public Intellectual, Species, Gender and Class in the Production of Knowledge with Nik. It was published in 2016. And Understanding Violence and Abuse, an Anti-Oppressive Practice Perspective with Kate Seymour, published in 2017. Nik Taylor is a critical and public sociologist whose research focuses on mechanisms of power and marginalisation, which is expressed in human-animal relations with other species and informed by critical intersectional feminism. We have been so lucky, it's unbelievably amazing year for us at NSCHAS to have welcomed Nik to Canterbury University, where she's an esteemed and very popular member of the New Zealand Centre for Human Animal Studies. She teaches topics at Canterbury University in the Human Services and Social Work program. They focus on human-animal violence links, scholar-advocacy, social change, crime and deviance, particularly domestic violence and animal abuse. I've mentioned some of the books that Heather and Nik have co-authored. Nik's also authored Ethnography After Humanism Power, Politics and Method in Multi-Species Research, published by Palgrave in 2017, and that was authored with Lindsay Hamilton. And the book that we're all talking about at the moment by Nik and Heather is this book that there's a flyer for in your packs. Companion Animals and Domestic Violence, Rescuing Me, Rescuing You, launched in May this year in Brisbane. There's a flyer that you can purchase this book, and you'll want to do this shortly because they're going to speak and it will be absolutely amazing. Yeah, so I'm not going to talk any longer. I'm going to hand it over to these two awesome critical animal studies and intersectional feminism scholars. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. That was gorgeous. And I also say it goes both ways. I've been very lucky to land a post where I'm in close proximity to Ernst Charles and able to work with these wonderful people closely all the time. So, kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Like Rick, I'm still learning my reo. I'm uncomfortable trying to do it in public, but I think half of the point of conferences like this is to make us uncomfortable so that we can grow through our discomfort, which is going to be my first point. So what I hopefully just said to you, not too poorly, was hello and welcome and thanks for being here, and then a big collective group welcome to all of us, because if you're like me, coming to these spaces where we can have these kind of discussions is terrifically important. So as I said, I'm going to start with the idea of discomfort. When Annie asked us to give this keynote, I was overjoyed, and then I was terrified. And then I started to think, well, I speak all the time in public, why am I so scared about this one? And I think it was about the theme, the idea of decolonization. I started to wonder, what would I, as a Pakeha, as a white woman, albeit working class, but a white woman who has had significant benefits from settler colonialism throughout her career, what would I have to say at a conference like this? What dare I say at a conference like this? I'm also a white woman who is steeped in Western intellectual academic traditions. I'm doing my best to resist them, but it's extremely hard to resist them when you work in the neoliberal academy. And all of this kind of collided around this notion of discomfort. But as I sat with this for a while, I thought, well, you use discomfort every day in the classroom. Those of us who teach in these areas where we're pushing people to think differently, to maybe get involved in advocacy, we know the value of well-managed discomfort in the classroom. So why not just turn that back on yourself? Comfort pushes us to think differently, as the quote says. And I think that full engagement with discomfort might allow or aid intersectional analyses that go beyond just the use of the term. So I think the idea of being discomforted, whether it's about our language use, whether it's about our positionality as colonizers, as Pakeha, as white people, whatever our discomfort comes from, I think it can be something that's really useful. But I think that discomfort needs to go multiple ways. So I'm steeped in feminist traditions. I'm increasingly, because of the invite to speak here, reading about decolonial scholars' work. And I'm noticing that there are silos. We have feminists who won't engage with speciesism. We have post-colonialists who won't engage with feminism. We have critical animal studies scholars who won't engage with decolonialism or feminism. And of course, we have some wonderful people who sit in the middle and engage with them all. As I started thinking about this and thinking about my discomfort and where I was sitting and what I was going to say to you, I realized that, and I will speak for both of us here, that as working class feminists working in a middle class academy who are vegans in a carnist world, we're already at the stage where we totally get the need to decolonize everything. So as soon as I realized that, I thought, okay, I can engage better now. And so off I went, and I am engaging more with work outside of my comfort zone, and I'm better for it. And I came to the realization that when I'm talking about the need to decolonize everything, what I'm talking about really is the need to change the lens. And Kirsty, in her beautiful paper, which I would recommend that you read if you haven't, on Mangatanga, apologies Kirsty if I've got that wrong, Maori Perspectives on Veganism and Plant-Based Kai, she quotes John Pawson as saying that veganism made him realise that at least one part of the prevailing cultural norm is a lie, and if one part's false, then the other parts can be as well. And that what we actually need is to change the way that we see things. We need to change the lens through which we view the world. And that made me think, well, as a feminist, I've been arguing that for years, as have feminists before me. But in turn, this requires an element of discomfort. You don't necessarily realise what needs to change unless you're willing to put yourself in a position of being discomforted by the status quo. In turn, that requires that we ask some tough questions of ourselves. And as an academic, which, you know, this is where I'm coming from, one of the questions that I am increasingly asking myself, working in a neoliberal academy that does not share my values, is what's the academic project that I want to be a part of? Why am I doing what I'm doing? I'm very committed to what I'm doing. I'm just not necessarily committed to the frameworks that I'm doing it within. Why am I researching? For whom am I researching? With whom do I want to research? How do we enroll those people that we want to research within our projects so that we can have meaningful discussions about intersections? So this is the kind of charged, difficult place that I'm working in and that I'm talking to you about. And the more I read about decolonisation, the more I thought, well, this all fits. This all fits together, not necessarily neatly. I'm an advocate for messy spaces, but there's a good conversation to be had at the heart of this, let's put it that way. But I've put this quote up there as a note of caution, that I do think that decolonisation increasingly is used as a metaphor, and I think, as the quote says, that can be problematic. We don't use it as a metaphor in our work. We see it as a way to uncover similar mechanics of oppression in much the same way as we would use feminism. It's a way for us to ask questions about how the species, racial and gender dominance are turned into hegemonic practices that underpin unequal power relations. And what that asks of us is that we don't reify one paradigm over the other. We don't say that feminist theories are better than decolonial theories. Decolonial theories are better than critical animal studies. What we do is accept that we need all of them in the mix. There's good bits and bad bits from them, and we need to have some meaningful conversations about how we pluck those bits out to use them and move forward. This then lets us get involved in what both Kirsty and Whitty referred to yesterday as the importance of imagining alternative worlds. One of the things I think that we need to do with and for other species is imagine different worlds for them, with us, without us. Imagine different ways of thinking about them and different ways of being with them, because what we've got clearly isn't working. So putting all these things together allows us to start asking these difficult questions. What imaginaries and subjectivities are foreclosed when our politics of decolonisation and/or feminism and/or speciesism are already anthropocentric? We need to step outside of this in order to start moving forward, even if the metaphor of moving forward is in itself problematic and somewhat colonial. Now, how does that fit with cross-species alliances and decolonisation and with the book that we are going to be talking around today? Well, these ideas of imagining different ways of being with other animals, of acknowledging other ways and respecting other ways of being with animals was at the heart of this project, as were these kind of theories around decolonisation. What we wanted to do in this book and in the projects that underpinned it was find ways to think about honouring the ways that we are with animals that don't replicate hierarchies and regimes of control or power. And so what we do in our work is we highlight cross-species alliances. We focus on the strong bonds that humans have with other animals, some humans have with other animals. We include other animals in our work where possible. Visibility is really key in research. I'm going to talk about that really briefly in a minute. We adopt the idea that research in and of itself as praxis can be a form of resistance. And we did that throughout the projects that underpinned this book. And we did it in three main ways. We did it methodologically, I'll move to that in a minute. We did it by centralising animals, by including them and by talking about them as victims of domestic violence in their own right, not just as adjuncts to human experiences. And we did it through a focus on love and connections, which is increasingly becoming an area of research that we're moving towards. Heather's been doing research on love for a long time, and she's kind of pulled me over to looking at that as well. And it's actually quite radical politics in today's university. I think it probably always has been, but certainly in today's university, to focus on love and connection through feminist eyes. And now adding to that we're focusing on love and connections across species, and you can imagine the response that we sometimes get to our work. Nevertheless, that's kind of where we're headed. Now, I'll just say briefly about the first one before I hand over to Heather, the idea of the methodological aspects. We built a visual research project. We had women who had experienced domestic violence. We interviewed them. Their animals had experienced violence or had experienced moving with them after the violence. We included the animals, we went to their homes, we sat for sometimes 2 or 3 hours talking to the humans with dogs, cats, birds surrounding us, and we brought them in as much as we could. And then we represented that visually. They had photographs taken by the local photography club as a way of thanking the women and giving them something to take away from the interview, some beautiful images, and we built that into a research project that the Northern Domestic Violence Service then showed around the northern suburbs of Adelaide in South Australia. But why did we want to do the visual aspect? Well, it's this notion of research as silencing marginalised communities. We know this when we start looking at any marginalised group. Mainstream dominant research tends not to address them other than to problematise them. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to give animals a voice, if indeed that's the right metaphor. We wanted to include them at least visually. We wanted to make sure that their stories were as represented as we could feasibly make them, given that we are humans and that we only have our flawed perspectives of other animals to work from. Sorry, I've forgotten to turn the slides. So why is it resistance research? Well, we're building on the ideas of Susan Strager and Leslie Brown, who work with Indigenous communities in Canada. It's feminist research because it acknowledges a link between hearing what people have to say, listening to them, and seeing that as part of a way of exposing the mechanisms of power. It's also about a willingness to hear voices that aren't. Animals are not left out of research by accident. It's deliberate thoughtlessness. They're deliberately silenced. This happens for a reason. So we wanted to counter that and bring them back in. How is it related to decolonization? For all of the things I've just said earlier, but also in this quote by Raewyn Connell, who's working on Southern theory at the minute, particularly the line at the end, that to ground knowledge of society and other experiences remains a fragile project. It's extremely difficult to see, to hear, to research alternate ways of doing things, alternate ways of being with other animals. And we wanted to contribute to this, as I say, in a very flawed way and in a very partial way, which we're happy to talk about later. We wanted to contribute to this in some way, and we wanted to make it really clear that, that animals are central to this project. It also builds on the work of Linda Turuai-Smith, who did some of the very earliest work around decolonizing methodologies here. And we see all of this together as kind of resistance research because it resists neoliberal imperatives to marginalize, to silence, to exclude. It brings in, highlights complexity and intersectionality of issues that are faced by those who are often then blamed for their circumstances. It resists university mandates, which is a whole other discussion which we won't get into today. And it focuses on the structural manifestations of asymmetrical power. It allows us to centralize animals, which is my cue to invite Heather up. Hey. I think I get the good bit. Centralising animals. Just a quick little anecdote. I worked at the shelter, the women's refuge that we did the research through when I was 18, so many decades ago. And when we went there and we talked about love and the possibility of what they call pets, talking with the women in relation to their animals, there was a kind of eye roll discomfort around the idea of love. And I think with that track record we could say, oh look, just suspend your disbelief and let's, can we proceed, which we did. And of course, one thing I think Ross's talk this morning brought it up. The women themselves that we spoke with had no issue with conceptualising their relationships in the loving terms. It's sometimes academics or scholarship takes a long time to catch up with what, quote, the ordinary people already know. And I don't think we should be proud of that, just as an aside. I certainly learnt that with the love and abuse study in the 90s that I did, where hairdressers and various other people would be absolutely on board, and every academic, or most academics, tried to dissuade me from the topic. So, centralising animals, one of the reasons was also move out the way male perpetrator, because we were looking at women who were in heterosexual relationships and their perpetrators had been men. And having grown up in that arrangement myself in a domestic violence situation, there's an enormous amount of time spent thinking about recovering from male perpetrators' violence. So get out the way, let's think about family in an interspecies sense, let's talk about how people, especially women, are experiencing those relationships. And it was quite funny when we were in interviews and we'd have a dog draped over us, and I'm a social worker, so, importance of eye contact and so forth, so I'd be looking underneath the belly of a dog asking a new question, to which I could say the participants didn't bat an eyelid, because that was completely normal. But I think if people who haven't got relationships with other animals might find that difficult. There's a picture of my recently departed beautiful cat Sunny. In terms of empathic love, I'm going to let you run your eye over that definition of what we're talking about. I use empathic rather than empathetic because it's quicker. I think what we're talking about is a sense of connection that is more than just pet affection. We've already spoken a little about the history of my research, at least, and more recently with Nik around love and abuse research. One of the things that I think is really important to understand is that love and abuse can coexist. It shouldn't. We don't like it to. We say it's not love if abuse is there, but actually if you speak to the very many people, and I'm from Australia, so more than one woman a week is being killed by her male partner at this point in time, so it's a crisis. Countless animals are being killed, tortured, persecuted, abandoned and so forth, sometimes necessarily so in terms of the surrendering. We don't even know the numbers of that because we haven't counted it, we haven't really explored it. The reality is that many of us have lived in relationships that contain both love and abuse, and that coexistence can be really confounding for people who are on the receiving end of abuse. And that also applies to companion animals, cats, dogs and the like. In terms of, I just want to say, on the one hand, I am really keen to point out the beautiful aspects of the potentiality of human-animal relationships, but on the other hand, I also want to acknowledge that human survivors of abuse don't always, although often they're kind to them, they're not always kind to the surviving animals. So we need to think about that too. Those, as a woman and as a, say, companion animal, our needs and interests can overlap, but they're not the same and they shouldn't be conflated. And I'm going to let you read this. It's a quote that came from one of the interviews. It was with an Indigenous woman, and she was referring to an experience of her husband that she'd been married to for a very long time. I think they had 5 children. And he would do all sorts of heinous acts to the companion animals that largely he would bring into the house. And of course we know, read the book if you want some more information about this, but we would know that they would use, perpetrators can often do this, bring animals into the house, use them as a point of leverage, bargaining chip, a pawn and so forth. In this story, the young boy ultimately vowed and kept the vow never to have a connection with a companion animal until he was an adult. That was the legacy of that. It was really sad. And Linda, his mum, or who we called Linda, she was very appreciative of the impact and very sorry for her so-called implication in that as a parenting regime, not being able to do something about the violent father. Of course, we hold women accountable. The policy of failure to protect is a really problematic policy. And we hold often non-abusive parents, and they're largely women, accountable for often men's violence, and that's not okay. And by extension, we shouldn't be holding them accountable for the violence that is perpetrated against other animals. This is a quote I'll let you read, and it's really about the ways in which connection with other animals can be life-saving. And we heard this over and over again. Not just the animals as family members, but also as some women sort of guiltily confess that their relationships with their companion animals were more pivotal in their recovery than their relationships with their children. Sorry, kids. Kids are notoriously needy, though. Companion animals are, notoriously giving. I think there's your answer. In terms of interspecies solidarity, this goes beyond the idea of bonds and deep-seated affection. If we're having solidarity, hierarchy must go. We must be equal, or at least be motioning or pursuing egalitarian relationships. So interspecies solidarity is really important to push our politics further. So this isn't just about, oh, how lovely that pets offer such a nice, so many health benefits to people and by extension women who survive violence and in their recovery. Not okay, that's just setting them up as objects of use. And of course, what we have to do is also think about the wider politics of pet keeping or companion animalship, animal companionship across the board. Do we have the right to keep animals in our homes? Are they enslaved? When we look at some of the practices of colonisation around control of fertility, the removal of offspring, the several other aspects, you can run your eye over that, including the practice of having favourites. There are some that are favourite. The rest can be reviled or treated in a really bad way. Just as a sidebar, I've been doing some dairy research with Nik and some others, and we certainly heard about house cows and the favourable treatment they can get compared to the rest of the nameless or sometimes numbered herd. In terms of the non-recognition of rights, what we could see were, and I think everyone, you can raise your hand after this and shout out, you're wrong if you want to, that companion animals, as much as we see them, the imagery, it's ubiquitous on the internet and so forth. In terms of companion animal rights, they're pretty low. And just look at the surrendering rate, the kill rate and so forth. Nik talked about the discomfort that she felt approaching this. I knew that there was a sort of dreaded comparison.
that in terms of racialised groups have often taken, or some members of racialised groups have taken umbrage at being connected to animals, closer to nature, closer to wild, savage and so forth, that kind of association, so I can understand that. Women too, feminists sometimes have objected to being similarly treated, closer to nature, associated with animals and so forth. I actually like being closer to animals. I think they're more decent than most humans, so for me it's a lovely comparison. The short... where it falls down is my experience of privilege, I think, is a far cry from many companion animals' experience of life. So that's important. Okay, so one of the things that I sometimes find very frustrating in academia is the endless critiques, endless clever exposés of X and Y and so forth, but very few crumbs, not even a breadcrumb trail, where to next? And come on, let's do it. Let's try and map it out, be bold. I'm going to say some things and you might think they're terrible ideas, but at least they've got you thinking about the future. So here goes with my terrible ideas. I think if you run your eye down those points, what we're going to see is there's a lot of overlapping experiences that I think are wise to see those connections. And feminist intersectionality has been a really important theory device for us to proceed. We've argued, of course, for the extension of speciesism to it because it wasn't designed initially for that. So these are some of my envisioning the future ideas. I think ecofeminism and feminism generally, particularly those that have reference non-human animals, has a lot to offer us. Historically, especially if you're in the university sector or wider, is that methodologically they have given us opportunities and language and tools for thinking beyond positivism, beyond the fantasy of neutrality and objectivity that big S science is so keen to promote. If you haven't already seen it, the Critical Animal Studies has a little link on YouTube, and it takes you through the principles of 10 principles of critical animal studies. They're fantastic principles. In fact, when I was coming at this talk, I thought to myself, I want to revisit that. I watched the thing and I thought, I'm going to keep in... That's going to be my guiding light for how I'm going to approach this. And I'm hoping that you'll see with the practical ending, the privileging of praxis or application is not some sort of daggy thing that because I'm from social work I should be embarrassed about, but I think it's a real important part of our work, as I've tried to convey. There are some basic things that we need to do. Many of you are doing this and have been doing it longer than me, so apologies for if I'm teaching you how to suck eggs, but obviously rejecting human exceptionalism and speciesism and calling it out where we can. In terms of thinking through the ways in which groups are animalised as a way of subordination. Really reflecting on neoliberalism and how it's so cleverly insinuated itself into so many of our systems and it generated really pernicious effects, including those towards non-human animals. And I was at an earlier talk where there was some discussion about, quote, livestock being treated as units. It's a neat way of course, distancing and not having to have any kind of moral code. So some of the other ideas are, and this is a big one, this is probably the right scene to be saying it in, but I can tell you even within my own workplace, which is public health and social work and pays homage to a lot about sustainability and climate change and so forth, talk about the end of animal agriculture and it's like, whoa, that's not received too well. So, but that's where we need to go, and I think all signs are pointing to that. Anyone Raise your hand if you don't think we should end animal agriculture. Okay, good. This is quite the crowd, isn't it? In terms of, and I laughed at this when I looked back on it and I said rejection of capitalist growth as though capitalism's okay, just not growth. I didn't mean that. I actually think that the economic order has a profound impact on how our relationships get played out in everyday life, even if they feel, quote, natural and organic. They are regulated through capitalism. In terms of consumption and waste, use of habitat, the endless deforestation, our hunger for just consuming resources that are extracted from every other species, potential areas of life. Rick talked about all sorts of extinction. Australians, I think, have been at the forefront of making that happen. Another proud Aussie achievement. In terms of, I think we need discussions. I haven't got all the answers. Are companion animal relationships ethical? I wouldn't say they're categorically unethical. That's my view. I would say it would depend on how you relate, what attention you pay to their needs, the kinds of relationships it is, whether they're an animal that is presents as being willing to enter into that relationship and so forth. I think, the message at the on one of the last slides was loving all animals, not just the ones that are in our homes. But I think the ones in our homes we need to also problematise in terms of their rights and their livelihood, how they're living their life. It's a good point to start on, in terms of, if you haven't done it already and you do live with other animals, is to start asking questions around what kind of life do you get to have? What kind of restrictions do I put on you? I'm an old 80s feminist, so the idea of the promise of liberation lives on for me. The promise of liberation, but also a concept I came across through vegans, actually, was about the burden of knowing, and sometimes the knowledge that we have, and anyone who keeps track on all of those issues like live export and so forth, and you see footage, it can be a burden knowing. And we do it, or I do it, for the promise of liberation, not just for the promise of more knowledge, but for the promise of change. And just as a last point, there's enormously good-hearted organisations that are doing some amazing work. Mostly they're staffed by women volunteers, often they're working class women who've got relatively little resources, who use whatever they have to try and rescue, to try and help and so forth. If you want to do something positive beyond just writing something that one of us can read, is also supporting these organisations, participating in really practical activities. And I'll leave it at that.